Alright, let's make another video where I respond to the comments in the last video I made regarding the Old Testament and morality. The first comment we have is this. This user says that objective morality is an oxymoron. Alright, well let's say we take that seriously, and what this user means to say is that the idea of objectiveness and morality are internally self-contradictory. Well, let's say we take that approach, and of course the alternative would be that morality is subjective. As I said in my last video, if you want to take a subjective approach to all forms of morality, if you do not believe there is an objective standard of morality, then you cannot approach the Old Testament and criticize it for being immoral, objectively speaking, of course. You can't say, God, why did you flood the world? That's objectively immoral if you don't believe in objective morality, right? So I usually find it's the people who say they believe in a subjectivist view of morality, they're also the first people to criticize other views of morality, which, of course, that is an oxymoron. And this user obviously wants to have his cake and eat it too, and I'm not even going to bother responding to it. Alright, let's take a look at this next comment. This user takes an objective stance against the Old Testament, although I guarantee you that if you asked him what is his view of morality, he would probably say it's subjective. Let's read the comment. Your God is immoral, and so are you, if you condone murder for the sake of, quote, saving humanity, especially when your God is also all-powerful. Alright, well, let's first of all create a scenario, alright? You're in a house, and you have your loved ones there, and a bunch of people are breaking in, and they're going to come and kill your family, and the only way you can stop them is to obliterate them, kill them, do anything you can to stop them. So is it immoral in this case to kill them? I would argue no. That's self-defense on behalf of your loved ones, which is precisely what God did when he flooded the world, killed the Canaanites, on and on it goes, as I argued in my last video. I'd also like you to notice that what you're saying is that murder is objectively wrong. That is the stance that you're taking here, which sounds a lot like thou shalt not murder. That sounds very biblical, doesn't it? So are you really taking a biblical approach to the Bible, in which case you're closer to biblical theistic morality than you might think? And I don't know, maybe you are an atheist, maybe you're not. I've never talked to you before, but anyways, thought that was interesting. As for God being all-powerful, what you're suggesting is that God could have found another way to stop them, other than killing them. Okay, well, what do you suggest? He could, I don't know, without, of course, removing their free will. Remember, free moral agents God created with the purpose of having that freedom, and when they use that freedom, only after the fact that they use it wrongly does God bring them into judgment. If God was to judge people before they do anything, well, then he'd sort of be like that movie Minority Report where they arrest people before they do anything, in which case they're arresting innocent people. So God allows people to go their own way, do their thing, do things wrong, and if they follow the path of evil, God will then judge them. So the issue here is God doesn't murder people. God does judge the guilty. Those who he kills are guilty. I'd also like to suggest that God can't murder by definition, since God is the giver of life, so he alone reserves the right to take it. After all, as the giver of life, life belongs to him. So if he wants to take it back, that is his initiative and his right alone as the creator of life. Alright, this next comment is probably what a lot of you guys are thinking right now, but God killed innocent babies, talking about the time of the flood. A pregnant wife back in the time of Noah might not be saved or righteous like Noah, but her fetus did no harm, except for having original sin. Therefore, God did break his own commandment. Well, I don't think God can break his own commandment, because murder is the unlawful killing of a life, and yet God is the author of life, and thus has the right to take it. It is human beings who have received the commandment, thou shalt not murder, from the lawgiver. He alone, who is the lawgiver and the judge of life, reserves the right, if he deems it necessary, to take a life. And there is no standard, there is no objective moral standard that you can erect to bring God into judgment. That is not to say God can do immoral things. The issue is that there is nothing God could do that could be considered immoral because there is no standard higher than God. Now, if you actually study the reasons that God flooded the world, it wasn't because of original sin. This person here says the fetus did no harm except for having original sin, and while it's true that they did, well, we have original sin today. I was born with it. You were born with it. And yet God's not killing us. The issue for the flood was not original sin. The reason for it was to do with the Nephilim and the goings-on of Genesis 6, how the world had become so corrupt and anti-God and violent that God felt the need to bring it to an end. This next comment, similar but different to the last one. So when God commands killed unborn children, it isn't murder because the unborn children have broken his laws? How exactly does a fetus possess the cognitive ability to break God's commandments? Obviously, it doesn't. And the Bible never suggests that they do. In fact, it says the opposite. Jesus said that the kingdom of God belongs to children, that the majority of the population of heaven likely will probably be these children who died prematurely because they're not held accountable for sin or original sin, although they are born with a sin nature, as you and I are, which is why our parents didn't have to teach us to lie, to steal, to cheat, to hate each other, on and on it goes. We do this quite naturally. That's why we have to be taught to do what's right. That's why we teach children to do what's right, and anyone who's raised a child before or remembers what they were like when they were a child, either because your parents told you stories or whatever, will know that that is true. God did not flood the world because of original sin. He flooded it because of the goings-on of Genesis 6. Do you actually believe that God would have to kill everyone in the world except for one family to get rid of the Nephilim? Couldn't he have simply made them all drop dead, remove their genes from the contaminated people, or just not create them in the first place? Well, God created Adam and Eve in a very specific way, and that way was different from how you and I are created. There is something to be said that natural processes have taken over since then, and the Nephilim were, the result of natural processes after fallen angels had sex with women. God was not the direct cause of the Nephilim. That being said, God also didn't flood the world just simply to get rid of the Nephilim, but also their influence over culture. And although it's true that they reappeared after the flood, if God flooded the world just to get rid of them, well, then he failed. They reemerged after the flood, although their influence over the world and culture was minuscule. Before the flood, apparently they contaminated the entire world with their anti-God and immoral behavior. After the flood, thanks to what God did at Babylon by splitting the people of the world into many nations, their influence was simply located in Canaan, and then God sent Israel in and just finished them off. Lastly, why didn't God just make them all drop dead? Well, by doing the worldwide flood, God left evidence. 3/4 of the world is still covered in water. We've got the stratification of the globe, of the earth, on an absolutely universal scale, showing a massive catastrophe. It's filled with dead bodies. We've got massive mountains and canyons and valleys and massive erosion and all kinds of stuff. And if you don't have evolutionary blinders on, it's very easy to see that this world has been through hell. Next question. How could the Nephilim reemerge if God killed them all in the flood? Genesis 6 says, in those days, the times of Noah, there were Nephilim on the earth, and also after that. You see, Nephilim are the children of fallen angels. Fallen angels are trans-dimensional beings. They can ascend and descend down and back from heaven to our earth. So when God flooded the world, he didn't kill the fallen angels, and they continued their activity after the flood. Now, you may ask, well, why didn't God just stop them from doing this activity? I would say that God gives human beings and angels a certain amount of freedom to do their thing, and then judges them after. After all, God is not like Minority Report, where he arrests people before they do anything, because then he'd be arresting innocent people. Just as, that was a big controversy in Minority Report. Good movie, by the way. Now, did the flood fail? Was the flood merely to wipe out the Nephilim, and did it fail because the Nephilim were appearing after the flood? The flood wasn't just to wipe out the Nephilim, it was also to wipe out their cultural impact on the entire world. After the flood, God split the world into nations through Babylon, so the Nephilim's influence was minute, or minuscule, compared to what it once was, and God then could effectively eliminate them with the Israelites in their conquest of the Canaanites. Now, I also would like to point out that the flood and the Canaanites, what God was doing was he was creating a picture of the end times. The Bible says over and over again in the New Testament that just as in the days of Noah were, so the end times shall be. And if you compare the conquest in the book of Joshua of the Canaanites and Jericho and compare it to the book of Revelation, you'll see a one-to-one correlation. God declares the end from the beginning, we learn. So God was actually creating a picture for us to understand the future through what took place in the past. That's a spiritual reason. May not be necessarily a justification, but if you're going to say, again, that all this stuff is immoral, you're erecting a objective standard, which I don't think you guys believe in, to the atheists out there. Next comment. So you make an argument that God was willing to command the various executions to preserve the salvation of humanity, and you make a good argument for reconciling the Old and New Testaments, but I am curious, with as much emphasis on preserving the salvation of humanity and the willingness to kill, why didn't God just kill Satan and eradicate eternal damnation? That's a good question. Let's answer that one by beginning with why didn't God just kill Satan? Satan affords God an interesting opportunity. Apparently, Satan, according to Isaiah and Ezekiel, was the most amazing created being that God could possibly make, the sum of beauty and wisdom. He was the most powerful created being that God ever made or ever will make. And by Satan rebelling against God and taking every possible avenue that Satan could possibly muster to try and dethrone or kill God, to the point of taking 1/3 of the angels and the entire human race, corrupting them and trying them to wage war against God, every avenue that Satan has ever taken will amount to nothing. It proves a point that every created being, with all of their wit, with all their power, with everything, with every attempt they could ever make, could never dethrone God. And when God judges and destroys Satan in the lake of fire, coming soon, well, it proves a point once and for all to all created beings for all eternity that every avenue of sin ever possibly taken could never dethrone God or challenge him. So by God allowing sin to run its course, God is going to prove once and for all that sin could never have a victory, and thus it is futile. So it is to make a point against sin. God allows sin for this small moment in time and is about to eradicate it once and for all. Just make sure you're not dead in your sins when that happens, or you're going to face eternal damnation. So why not eradicate eternal damnation? Because it's necessary to allow free moral agents to go their own way, and if they choose to do evil, there has to be a punishment. And if people are unrepentant and want to remain evil and anti-God forever, then there is nothing less than eternal punishment for them. It's logical. If you don't want to be with God forever, then you're going to be without God forever. And if you're without God forever, that is eternal damnation. Are you really that lacking in empathy for your fellow human, writes this commenter? Skipping the middle part, enslaving someone or stoning an unruly child or forcing a woman to marry her rapist does hurt someone and is therefore immoral. Well, I've got a few problems with this. First of all, this is the no-harm principle, that we can judge what is or is not moral by if we hurt anyone. But I can think of plenty of cases where hurting someone is the moral thing to do. There's a simple case of giving a child an injection, even if it hurts, to save their life or whatever. Or going to a justified war. Should we not have hurt the Nazis? Sure, they were hurting people, but if it's immoral to hurt people, period, well, then we shouldn't have hurt them back for hurting people, because that would have been immoral. No. There is a justification for hurting people. In this case, though, forcing a woman to marry her rapist, you've got that backwards. It was forcing the man to marry his victim, to provide for her. Because if you just kill the rapist, then the rapist can't do anything for her benefit. A woman who was raped, especially in the ancient world, virginity was a big deal, chastity as well as purity. She would probably never get married. So this was providing for her for the rest of her life. And you can be assured, this is not written in the text, but you could be assured that everyone knew that this guy had raped his wife, his now-to-be wife, and if he mistreated her, everyone would be all on top of that and probably kick the snot out of the guy. That's between the text, or not in the text. Just an assumption, I suppose. God gave that law to discourage rape. God is giving a provision for the victim, but also discouraging the behavior. If a rapist knows that if he rapes a woman, he's going to have to provide for her for the rest of his life under law or be killed, he's probably not going to do it. And I imagine rape in Israel was probably a very small percentage of what goes on in America. Maybe America should enforce something like that, and we'd see a drop in the statistics. In Israel, if a man slept with a woman before marriage, God saw them as being married, because sex isn't just physical, it's spiritual, the bringing together of a man and a woman. And even in a rape situation, there is still a bonding between the two, even if the woman hates the guy and it wasn't her consent and all that, and that's tragic. There is still that spiritual dimension that remains objectively true about sex, and thus they're seen as married. What else we got here? Stoning unruly child. If every child in the community knows that if they disobey their parents, they're going to get killed, you'd probably see some obedient children. Again, the commandment is meant to encourage obedience, and obedience in Israel, remember these commandments were only given to Israel, obedience in Israel was paramount because they were given the mission to save the world. This was not a joke. If children are raised to be obedient, they will be obedient adults unto God. If they were allowed to be disobedient as children, they would grow up to be delinquents and thus jeopardize the mission of salvation of Israel. Now, as for the slavery thing, I did cover this in the last video, and I'm curious as to where you're getting the objective standard that says thou shalt not have a slave, because that's Bible talk, saying thou shalt not. So if you're really going to say the Bible's immoral for having a culture at a time in history that had slaves and giving them certain laws regarding it, specifically the one that if someone kidnaps someone and makes them a slave, well, they're to be put to death. I'm actually going to link right here on the screen. If this is on my original channel, there'll be an annotation to a video by John MacArthur concerning slavery. I think you guys should check it out.